October 6th, 1973, the Arab states of Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. A conflict begins known as the Yom Kippur War, a conflict in which the US's support for Israel leads to the Arab oil embargo. Shockwaves reverberate around the globe with far-reaching consequences, including the quadrupling of crude oil prices in just a few months. 6 years later, 1978, and in the wake of the Iranian Revolution, oil production from the country plummets, further doubling the price of oil and pushing much of the world into the worst recession since World War II. Nearly 50 years later to the day since the beginning of the conflict in 1973, and a war is once again plaguing the same region. So whilst history doesn't repeat itself, it often rhymes, begging the question of what would another oil crisis stemming from the Middle East look like today, and are we any more prepared than we were just 50 years ago? Tensions are high in the Middle East, and in the fog of war, there's always a risk that the unpredictability of a local conflict can become regional. As of this writing, Saudi Arabia has pledged for the halt of military operations within the region, but probably has no interest in getting the country involved more deeply in the conflict. The country relies on the US for its own defense and as a large customer for their crude oil, so they have no interest in leading a 1973-style embargo anytime soon. Oil prices are already within the range that Mohammed bin Salman needs to bring in revenue to push his vision for the region. Prices any higher would likely create demand destruction and have the opposite effect. But this doesn't mean that the conflict can't cause further disruption to energy markets. Iran is a key supporter of the Hamas regime in Palestine and could threaten global oil supplies by blockading the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has previously threatened to block this shipping lane, which would prevent the export of oil from OPEC members like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Iraq, accounting in total for over 20% of global supply. Iranian-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen could also attack ships at the mouth of the Red Sea to further disrupt oil cargo bound for Europe. The group's recent use of missiles and drones against Israel, of which a US Navy destroyer located in the Red Sea intercepted, shows that the group have medium-range capabilities to do this. But whatever the means of disruption, a disruption itself is not unlikely, and this would put pressure on an already stretched oil market. So how vulnerable is the West to a crisis like this? Well, first we have to compare today to the 1970s.
Good evening. The Middle East War produced developments all over the world today. The oil-producing countries of the Arab world decided to use their oil as a political weapon. They will reduce oil production by 5% a month until the Israelis withdraw from occupied territories. If the Arab countries keep that pledge, it would reduce their production by almost 50% in 1 year.
Rising oil prices were a key contributor to the stagflationary economies seen around the world during the 1970s. In the 1973 crisis directly led to GDPs declining by 4.7% in the US, 2.5% in Europe, and 7% in the more energy import-reliant Japan. But these statistics don't truly highlight how much oil prices impacted society at the time. Life in the 1970s was highly reliant on oil as the primary energy source that powered the world, so the quadrupling in the price of the thing that powers everything had huge consequences. Fuel shortages and price hikes led to leaders calling for gas station closures on Sundays, the implementation of Christmas light bans, heating controls, speed limits on highways. Sports events were empty for periods of time in much of the US and Europe, whilst the US's proud auto industry faced a shock of its own, as the country's gas-guzzling models were going out of favour compared to the more fuel-efficient Japanese cars. You could definitely argue that the West is similarly vulnerable to an oil shock today. Several countries are self-sanctioning by reducing or outright banning the import of oil from Russia, thus forcing a stronger reliance on Middle Eastern crude. Oil is in somewhat of a supply deficit, leading to prices staying in their historically higher price bands, with OPEC's several production cuts this year further contributing to this. Stockpiles like the US's Strategic Petroleum Reserve is at its lowest level in 40 years, and instability around the world is at all-time highs. All signs that this is a crisis waiting to happen. But it's hard to ignore that things are very different now compared to 50 years ago. Whilst the US's SPR is historically low, in 1973 strategic inventories like this didn't really exist. In fact, the SPR was created as a direct response to the 1973 crisis. Today, most OECD countries have strategic petroleum reserves equal to 90 days of the country's net oil imports. This, whilst not being a long-term solution, would prevent all-out shortages and panic like many experienced in the 70s. Several emergency oil sharing and storage agreements now exist between countries to allow for the purchase of oil in times of crisis, whilst institutions like the IEA, who conduct analysis and recommend energy security policies to prevent future crises, were created in response to the oil supply disruptions of the 1970s. Another key point is the oil intensity of GDP percentage. Simply put, a metric that determines how important oil is to a society. Well, this metric states that at its peak in the 70s, 1 barrel of oil was needed to create $1,000 of global GDP. But over 50 years of changing preferences and technical improvements requiring less oil to produce the same products, and the world has become a little less dependent on oil to run things. Now, less than half a barrel of oil is needed to create $1,000 of GDP. So whilst the weaponization of oil would have widely felt effects, the result might not be as drastic as it was for society in the 1970s. And just as the world has changed over the past 50 years, so too has the scope of oil producers around the globe.
Once considered impossible, American energy independence has become a reality. And for better or for worse, it's all thanks to fracking, the spoils of which have spurred what's commonly called the shale revolution.
The situation regarding oil in 1970s America was one of concern. In 1970, US oil fields had reached their peak production at around 11.5 million barrels per day and quickly began to decline thereafter. This was at a time where US demand was only growing, meaning that the country had to quickly ramp up their oil imports, which doubled to 6 million barrels by 1973, with OPEC countries accounting for over half of these imports. By 1977, oil imports had increased to nearly 9 million barrels, 85% of which came from OPEC, satisfying nearly 50% of America's total consumption requirements. People blamed Eisenhower's Drain America First policy, which limited foreign imports of oil in the previous decade, but the result was a heavy reliance on foreign oil in the 1970s, so it was no surprise that cuts to these supplies caused a drastic shock to the country. But things are much different now. Globally, the US is now the largest producer of oil in the world, with the advent of modern drilling techniques allowing the US to trump its 1970s oil production peak. This means that the country's production exceeds its levels of consumption for the first time in over 70 years. So whilst the nation still imports from around the world, as of 2022, the US was a net exporter of oil. Whilst the US could direct this production domestically in the event of a shock, the situation in Europe is quite the opposite. In Europe, oil production peaked a little later than the US, but unlike the States, the continent hasn't seen a recent resurgence in oil production. With few exceptions like the Edvard Grieg and Johan Sverdrup oil fields in the North Sea, European production has been in decline for a couple of decades. So despite Middle Eastern oil only accounting for less than 20% of European imports, with natural gas playing a far more important role within European economies, a crisis stemming from the Middle East would no doubt be more disruptive to Europe compared to the US, potentially causing another wave of inflation to run through the continent, as we saw in 2022. Whatever the means of disruption, US and European military vessels will be on high alert to respond to any disturbances in the region and secure their supply of oil. So whilst the geopolitical landscape of the world is much different than it was 50 years ago, this time the West does seem to be more prepared for a 1970s style crisis once again.